This is your captain speaking. We have a situation in the cabin. Flight attendants, please report to your stations immediately. The radio crackled with tension as Flight 2574 began what would become one of the most haunting tales in aviation history, not because of mechanical failure or pilot error, but because of something far more insidious that had been slowly destroying lives from within the very industry meant to connect our world. Sarah Martinez had dreamed of soaring through the clouds since she was 7 years old, watching planes trace silver lines across the Texas sky from her bedroom window in San Antonio. 22 years later, that dream had transformed into a nightmare she never could have imagined, and her final text message to her sister would reveal the terrifying reality that thousands of flight attendants face every single day. A reality so devastating that it claimed her life before she even had the chance to truly live it. The morning of October 15th started like any other for Sarah, her third month as a flight attendant with Pinnacle Airlines, a regional carrier that prided itself on connecting small communities across the American Southwest. She had graduated from flight attendant training with stellar reviews, her instructors praising her natural ability to remain calm under pressure and her genuine care for passenger safety and comfort. Her training had prepared her for medical emergencies, turbulence, evacuations, and even potential hijacking scenarios. But nothing in that intensive 6-week program had prepared her for the psychological warfare that awaited her at 30,000 feet. The airline industry, with its relentless schedules, impossible standards, and culture of silent suffering, had created a perfect storm that was about to claim another victim. And Sarah's story would expose the dark underbelly of an industry that markets glamour while delivering trauma. Sarah's journey to becoming a flight attendant had been anything but easy, born from a childhood fascination that grew into an unshakable determination despite the obstacles life threw in her path. Growing up in a working-class family in San Antonio, she was the first in her family to even consider a career in aviation, her parents working double shifts at local manufacturing plants to make ends meet, while Sarah excelled in school and dreamed of a life beyond the limitations of her circumstances. Her mother, Rosa Martinez, had emigrated from Mexico with dreams of her own, working as a seamstress in a downtown factory, while her father, Miguel, spent his days in construction under the brutal Texas sun. They sacrificed everything to give Sarah opportunities they never had, watching with pride and worry as their daughter set her sights on a career that seemed as distant and impossible as the planes that flew overhead. During high school, Sarah worked part-time at a local diner to help with family expenses while maintaining perfect attendance and a grade point average that earned her a partial scholarship to the University of Texas at San Antonio. She studied hospitality management, believing it would prepare her for her ultimate goal of becoming a flight attendant. But the financial strain of college proved too much for her family. After 2 years, she made the difficult decision to leave university and pursue her aviation dreams directly, enrolling in flight attendant training school, using money she had saved from years of working weekends and summers. Her parents were heartbroken to see her leave college, but they understood that their daughter had inherited their determination and work ethic, along with a dream that burned too brightly to be extinguished by financial hardship. The flight attendant training program at Pinnacle Airlines was located in a nondescript building near Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, where Sarah spent 6 weeks learning everything from safety procedures to passenger service standards. The training was intense and comprehensive, covering emergency evacuations, first aid, firefighting, self-defense, and the complex federal regulations that govern commercial aviation. Sarah thrived in the structured environment, her natural empathy and communication skills making her a standout among her classmates. She learned to demonstrate the proper way to put on an oxygen mask, how to operate emergency slides, the locations of every piece of safety equipment on different aircraft types, and the protocols for dealing with everything from unruly passengers to medical emergencies at 30,000 feet. But the training program, like most in the industry, focused almost exclusively on the technical and procedural aspects of the job, while largely ignoring the psychological and physical toll that the career would exact on its practitioners. There were no modules on managing sleep deprivation, no discussions about the mental health challenges that come with irregular schedules and constant travel, no preparation for the verbal abuse and physical threats that flight attendants routinely face from increasingly hostile passengers. The training painted a picture of adventure and glamour, of seeing the world and meeting interesting people, while carefully avoiding any mention of the poverty-level wages, the cramped crash pads, the missed holidays and family gatherings, or the toll that constantly changing time zones would take on their bodies and relationships. Sarah graduated from training in July, receiving her wings in a ceremony attended by her proud parents, who had driven 12 hours from San Antonio to watch their daughter achieve her dream. The ceremony was held in a hotel conference room with fluorescent lighting and cheap decorations. Nothing like the glamorous affair Sarah had imagined, but she was too excited to care. She had finally achieved her childhood dream, and she was ready to begin the career she had worked so hard to attain. Her first assignment was to the Denver crew base, where she would be flying regional routes throughout the Mountain West and Southwest, serving small communities that depended on regional airlines to connect them to the broader aviation network. The reality of life as a regional flight attendant hit Sarah like a physical blow from her very first day on the job. Her starting salary was $28,000 per year, barely above the federal poverty line, and she quickly discovered that her take-home pay after taxes, union dues, and mandatory uniform costs left her with barely enough money to survive. She was forced to share a crash pad apartment with 3 other flight attendants, sleeping in bunk beds and living out of a suitcase because there was no space for personal belongings. The apartment was a converted 2-bedroom unit near Denver International Airport, with 4 flight attendants sharing 1 bathroom and taking turns sleeping in shifts because their schedules rarely aligned. The scheduling system at Pinnacle Airlines was designed to extract maximum productivity from its flight attendants while staying just within the bounds of federal regulations that limited their duty time. Sarah found herself working trips that began before dawn and ended well after midnight, with minimal rest between flights and no guarantee of regular sleep patterns. The company used a bidding system that gave preference to senior flight attendants, meaning that newcomers like Sarah were stuck with the most undesirable schedules, often working holidays, weekends, and red-eye flights, while the veterans enjoyed better routes and more predictable schedules. Her typical month included trips that might start in Denver, take her to Phoenix, then to Albuquerque, then to Dallas, then back to Denver over the course of 3 or 4 days, followed by a single day off before starting another grueling rotation. The company provided hotel rooms during layovers, but these were often budget accommodations near airports, with paper-thin walls, broken air conditioning, and the constant noise of aircraft operations making restful sleep nearly impossible. Sarah found herself subsisting on airport food, vending machine snacks, and whatever meals she could grab during brief layovers, her body struggling to adapt to the constant changes in time zones and meal times. The passengers presented their own unique challenges, particularly in the post-pandemic era when air travel had become increasingly stressful and frustrating for everyone involved. Sarah encountered passengers who had been drinking heavily before boarding, families traveling with screaming children in cramped aircraft cabins, business travelers who blamed flight attendants for weather delays and mechanical problems beyond their control, and individuals who seemed to view the flight crew as personal servants rather than safety professionals. She was yelled at for enforcing carry-on size restrictions, blamed for turbulence, and subjected to inappropriate comments about her appearance and personal life on a regular basis. One particularly disturbing incident occurred during Sarah's 6th week on the job, when a male passenger in first class made repeated sexual comments and tried to grab her as she served his meal. When Sarah reported the incident to the captain, she was told to handle it professionally and avoid making a scene that might upset other passengers. The company's incident report process was lengthy and bureaucratic, requiring multiple forms and witness statements, and Sarah was made to feel like she was causing trouble by reporting harassment, rather than being supported as a victim of workplace abuse. The passenger faced no consequences for his behavior, while Sarah was left feeling vulnerable and unsupported by the company she had dreamed of working for. The physical demands of the job were relentless, and took a toll that Sarah had not anticipated during her training. Flight attendants are required to be on their feet for most of their duty time, lifting heavy bags into overhead compartments, pushing meal carts through narrow aisles, and maintaining their balance during turbulence while serving passengers. Sarah developed chronic back pain from the repetitive lifting and awkward positions required by the aircraft cabin configuration. but she was afraid to report the injury for fear of being grounded or losing her job. Many of her colleagues suffered from similar ailments, popping over-the-counter pain medications and using compression stockings to manage the swelling and discomfort that came with spending long hours on their feet in the low-pressure environment of an aircraft cabin. The irregular schedule wreaked havoc on Sarah's circadian rhythms, leaving her in a constant state of jet lag even when she was not crossing time zones. Her body never had time to adjust to a regular sleep pattern because her schedule changed week to week, sometimes requiring her to wake up at 3 in the morning for an early departure, and other times keeping her working until midnight or later. Sleep became elusive and fragmentary, with Sarah often lying awake in her crash pad bunk, listening to the sounds of airport operations and her roommates coming and going at all hours. She began taking over the counter sleep aids, but they left her groggy and disoriented, making it even harder to perform her duties safely and effectively. The financial stress was constant and overwhelming, despite working what should have been a professional career. Sarah's paychecks were eaten up by basic living expenses, leaving her with no money for savings, entertainment, or the kind of lifestyle that the airline industry marketing materials suggested flight attendants enjoyed. She qualified for food stamps but was too proud to apply, instead skipping meals and stretching every dollar to make it to the next payday. Her parents offered to help financially, but Sarah knew they could barely afford their own expenses and refused to burden them with her struggles. She watched her college friends posting pictures from their jobs in offices and retail, earning more money and enjoying regular schedules, while she struggled to survive in what she had thought would be her dream career. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Sarah's experience as a flight attendant. Her schedule made it impossible to maintain relationships with friends and family back home, and the transient nature of her work prevented her from forming deep connections in Denver. She was constantly surrounded by people, from passengers to crew members, but she felt profoundly alone in her struggles. The culture of the airline industry discouraged complaining or showing weakness, with senior flight attendants often telling newcomers to toughen up or find another job if they could not handle the demands. Mental health resources were theoretically available through the company's employee assistance program, but accessing them required admitting to problems that could potentially jeopardize her career. During her second month on the job, Sarah began experiencing panic attacks during flights, episodes of overwhelming anxiety that left her gasping for breath and feeling like she was going to die. The attacks usually occurred during boarding, when the aircraft cabin felt like it was closing in on her, and the weight of responsibility for passenger safety seemed unbearable. She learned to hide in the galley during these episodes, splashing cold water on her face and practicing breathing exercises she had learned online, terrified that someone would notice her distress and report it to management. The attacks became more frequent and severe as her body and mind struggled to cope with the accumulated stress of her new career. Sarah's relationship with food became increasingly dysfunctional, as the irregular schedule and constant stress disrupted her normal eating patterns. Sometimes she would go 12 or 14 hours without a proper meal, surviving on coffee and crackers from the aircraft galley, only to binge eat during layovers when she finally had access to real food. Her weight began to fluctuate dramatically, and she noticed that her clothes either hung loosely on her shrinking frame or felt uncomfortably tight after periods of stress eating. Her complexion became pale and drawn, dark circles formed under her eyes, and her hair began to fall out in clumps due to the nutritional deficiencies and chronic stress she was experiencing. The day of October 15th began at 4:30 in the morning at Denver International Airport, where Sarah was scheduled to work a grueling 4-leg rotation that would take her from Denver to Dallas, Dallas to Phoenix, Phoenix to Albuquerque, and finally, Albuquerque, back to Denver. It was the kind of schedule that pushed flight attendants to their absolute limits, with minimal rest between flights and no time for proper meals or mental health breaks. Sarah had worked similar rotations dozens of times in her brief career, but her reserves were depleted, and her body was running on empty after months of accumulated stress and neglect. The crew briefing that morning took place in a sterile room near the departure gate, where Captain Robert Hayes and First Officer Jennifer Kim reviewed the day's weather conditions, passenger loads, and any special considerations for their flights. Sarah and her fellow flight attendant Jessica Chen listened attentively as they discussed the routing and timing for each leg, but Sarah found it difficult to concentrate through the fog of exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Jessica noticed that Sarah seemed unusually quiet and distracted, but in the fast-paced world of commercial aviation, there was no time to address personal concerns before the first passengers began boarding. Flight 2574's first leg from Denver to Dallas-Fort Worth operated with a Boeing 737-300, an older aircraft that had been in service for over 2 decades, but remained a reliable workhorse for regional operations. The passenger load was nearly full, with 128 travelers, including business people heading to meetings, families visiting relatives, and tourists beginning their journeys to destinations throughout the Southwest. Sarah performed her pre-flight safety checks with mechanical precision, testing emergency equipment and reviewing passenger manifest information. But her colleagues noticed that she seemed to be moving in slow motion, as if every task required enormous effort to complete. During the boarding process for the Denver to Dallas flight, Sarah encountered her first difficult passenger of the day, a businessman who became increasingly agitated when she explained that his oversized carry-on bag would need to be checked. He began shouting about important meetings and threatened to have her fired for incompetence and poor customer service, attracting the attention of other passengers and creating a tense atmosphere before the flight even departed. Sarah handled the situation professionally, following company procedures and maintaining her composure despite the verbal abuse. But the encounter left her hands shaking and her heart racing as she completed the safety demonstration. The flight to Dallas proceeded without incident, but Sarah found herself struggling to maintain her usual level of enthusiasm and energy during passenger service. She spilled coffee on a passenger's laptop, forgot drink orders, and had to ask Jessica to help her with tasks she normally handled easily. Jessica covered for her colleague, recognizing the signs of exhaustion and stress that were all too common in their profession, but she began to worry about Sarah's ability to complete the demanding day ahead of them. During the brief layover in Dallas, Sarah sat in the crew lounge staring at her phone, too tired to eat the sandwich she had purchased, and too anxious to rest properly. The Dallas to Phoenix segment presented new challenges as the aircraft encountered moderate turbulence over the desert Southwest, causing several passengers to become airsick and creating additional work for the already overwhelmed crew. Sarah found herself cleaning up vomit while trying to reassure nervous flyers, all while fighting her own rising panic as the turbulence triggered memories of her recurring nightmares about aircraft crashes. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, classic signs of an anxiety attack, but she forced herself to continue working because stopping was not an option in an industry that viewed any sign of human weakness as grounds for immediate discipline or termination. It was during the brief layover in Phoenix that Sarah's facade finally began to crack completely. Sitting in the crew lounge with 30 minutes between flights, she pulled out her phone with trembling hands and began typing a text message that would later be recognized as a cry for help that went unheeded. Her message to her sister Maria was brief but devastating in its honesty. "This job is killing me. I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't think straight anymore. Every time I get on a plane, I feel like I'm going to die. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I love you." Maria was in a client meeting at her accounting firm in San Antonio when the message arrived, and she glanced at her phone but decided to respond later, not recognizing the desperation behind her sister's words. The Phoenix to Albuquerque leg should have been routine, a short hop across the desert that regional airlines operated multiple times daily. But for Sarah, it became a nightmare of escalating psychological distress. During the pre-flight safety briefing, she found herself unable to remember basic procedures she had performed hundreds of times, staring blankly at the emergency equipment card while Jessica prompted her through the checklist. Her movements became increasingly erratic and disconnected, as if she were operating her body from a great distance, and passengers began to notice that something was wrong with one of their flight attendants. Midway through the flight to Albuquerque, Sarah experienced what can only be described as a complete dissociative episode, standing in the aircraft galley, staring at the beverage cart, as if she had never seen it before in her life. Jessica found her there several minutes later, completely unresponsive to verbal prompts, her eyes unfocused and her breathing rapid and shallow. It took several attempts to bring Sarah back to awareness, and when she finally responded, she had no memory of the previous few minutes and seemed confused about where she was and what she was supposed to be doing. The brief layover in Albuquerque provided no relief for Sarah's deteriorating condition, as she sat in the crew lounge rocking back and forth slightly while staring at the departure board. without seeming to process the information displayed there. Jessica tried to engage her in conversation, asking if she felt well enough to continue working, but Sarah's responses were disconnected and rambling, touching on topics that seemed to have no relationship to their current situation. She talked about her childhood dog, her mother's cooking, and her plans to redecorate her childhood bedroom as if she were still living at home rather than sharing a crash pad with 3 other flight attendants. The final leg from Albuquerque to Denver began normally enough, with Sarah managing to complete the pre-flight checklist and safety demonstration despite her obvious distress. The passengers boarded without major incidents, and Captain Hayes was unaware of the drama unfolding in the cabin as he prepared for departure. Sarah had become expert at hiding her struggles from the flight deck crew, knowing that any sign of incapacity would result in her immediate removal from duty and potentially the end of her career. The culture of commercial aviation demanded perfection from everyone involved, and admitting to mental health struggles was tantamount to professional suicide. Approximately 40 minutes into the final flight, as the aircraft cruised at 31,000 feet over the Colorado Rockies, Sarah's body and mind finally reached the breaking point that had been building for months. She was in the middle of the beverage service, pushing the heavy cart down the narrow aisle and taking drink orders from passengers, when she suddenly stopped moving and began swaying back and forth. A passenger in seat 12A later described watching Sarah's face go completely pale before she stumbled backward and collapsed onto the galley floor with a sound that could be heard throughout the cabin. Jessica immediately rushed to Sarah's aid, finding her colleague unconscious but breathing, her pulse rapid and thready, her skin cold and clammy to the touch. Sarah's eyes rolled back in her head, and she began having what appeared to be seizure activity, her body convulsing uncontrollably while passengers looked on in horror. Jessica immediately called for medical assistance over the aircraft's public address system, while trying to stabilize Sarah's position and ensure that her airway remained clear. A passenger who identified himself as a paramedic came forward to assist, but it quickly became clear that Sarah's condition was beyond what could be treated in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. Captain Hayes declared a medical emergency and requested vectors to the nearest suitable airport, which was Denver International, still 20 minutes away at their current altitude and speed. The air traffic controllers immediately cleared other aircraft from their path and authorized an expedited descent, while the flight crew worked frantically to stabilize their colleague. Sarah regained consciousness briefly during the descent, but she was delirious and incoherent, repeatedly saying that she couldn't do this anymore and asking for her mother. Her vital signs remained unstable, and Jessica later described feeling helpless as she watched her friend and colleague slipping away despite their best efforts. The emergency landing at Denver International Airport brought every available emergency vehicle racing to meet Flight 2574, creating a dramatic scene that was captured by passengers and shared on social media within minutes. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency medical teams surrounded the aircraft as soon as it reached the gate, and paramedics rushed aboard to take over Sarah's care from the flight crew and volunteer passenger. The other passengers were evacuated quickly and efficiently, while the medical team worked to stabilize Sarah's vital signs and prepare her for transport to the hospital. Sarah was rushed to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital in downtown Denver, where emergency room physicians immediately recognized that she was suffering from more than just a simple medical emergency. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, her heart rate was erratic, and blood tests revealed severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and signs of acute malnutrition that suggested months of inadequate self-care. The attending physician, Dr. Margaret Chen, later testified that Sarah's condition was consistent with someone who had been under extreme physical and psychological stress for an extended period, and that her collapse was the inevitable result of pushing her body beyond its limits for too long. The hospital immediately contacted Sarah's emergency contacts, bringing her parents racing from San Antonio, while her sister Maria caught the first available flight from San Antonio to Denver. The Martinez family had known that Sarah was struggling with her new career, but they had no idea how serious her condition had become until they saw her lying unconscious in the intensive care unit, connected to machines that monitored her failing vital signs. Rosa Martinez later described the shock of seeing her vibrant, ambitious daughter reduced to a shadow of her former self, her face gaunt and her body showing the physical toll of months of neglect and abuse. For 3 days, Sarah fought for her life, while her family maintained a constant vigil beside her hospital bed. The doctors explained that her body was shutting down from the accumulated stress and neglect, with multiple organ systems beginning to fail simultaneously. Her liver was struggling to process the toxins that had built up in her system from months of irregular eating and chronic dehydration. Her kidneys were not functioning properly due to the severe electrolyte imbalances, and her cardiovascular system was under enormous strain from the constant flood of stress hormones that had been coursing through her bloodstream for months. The medical team did everything possible to stabilize Sarah's condition, including intravenous fluids, medications to support her failing organs, and careful monitoring of her brain function to ensure that the prolonged stress had not caused permanent neurological damage. Her family took turns sitting with her, talking to her unconscious form and playing her favorite music in the hope that familiar sounds might help bring her back to consciousness. Jessica and several other flight attendants from Pinnacle Airlines also visited, creating a small community of support around Sarah's hospital bed as she fought the battle of her life. On October 18th, 3 days after her collapse on Flight 2574, Sarah Martinez passed away peacefully in her hospital bed, surrounded by her loving family and the flight attendant colleagues who had become her chosen family during her brief career in aviation. The official cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure secondary to acute stress reaction, but everyone who knew Sarah understood that she had been killed by an industry that demanded everything from its workers while providing almost nothing in return except the promise of a career that had ultimately cost her everything she held dear. Sarah's death sent shockwaves through Pinnacle Airlines and the broader aviation community, forcing uncomfortable conversations about working conditions, mental health support, and the human cost of the industry's business model. Her story was picked up by aviation trade publications, labor unions, and eventually mainstream media outlets that recognized the broader implications of what had happened to this young woman who had dreamed of nothing more than serving others while seeing the world. Her death became a catalyst for changes that were long overdue, but had been ignored by an industry more focused on profits than the well-being of its employees. The investigation into Sarah's death revealed systemic problems within Pinnacle Airlines and the regional aviation industry as a whole that went far beyond individual company policies or practices. Federal investigators discovered that Sarah's experience was not unique, but rather representative of thousands of flight attendants who were struggling with similar challenges while suffering in silence. The investigation revealed that regional airlines routinely scheduled their crews to the maximum limits allowed by federal regulations, often pushing flight attendants to work 14-hour days with minimal rest between duties, creating conditions that were unsustainable for human health and well-being. The financial pressures faced by regional flight attendants were particularly shocking to investigators who had assumed that airline employees enjoyed middle-class lifestyles commensurate with their professional responsibilities. Sarah's pay stubs revealed that she had earned less than $30,000 in her final year of life, qualifying her for government assistance programs despite working for a major airline. Her living situation in the crash pad apartment was found to be typical for regional flight attendants, many of whom could not afford individual housing on their poverty-level wages and were forced to share cramped accommodations with multiple roommates while working demanding schedules that made normal social relationships nearly impossible. The investigation also uncovered disturbing patterns of harassment and abuse that flight attendants routinely endured from passengers, with company policies that prioritized customer satisfaction over employee safety and dignity. Sarah's incident reports revealed multiple cases of verbal abuse, sexual harassment, and even physical threats from passengers. But in each case, the company's response had been to counsel her on customer service excellence rather than taking meaningful action to protect her from future incidents. The culture of the airline industry, investigators found, treated flight attendants as expendable customer service representatives rather than the trained safety professionals they actually were. Mental health resources at Pinnacle Airlines were found to be woefully inadequate, consisting primarily of an employee assistance program that required workers to self-identify their struggles to supervisors who had the power to ground them or terminate their employment. The company provided no proactive mental health screening, no regular check-ins with employees who were showing signs of stress or burnout, and no meaningful support for workers who were struggling to adapt to the demands of their careers. The investigation revealed that Sarah had never accessed the company's mental health resources because she was afraid that doing so would jeopardize her job and end the career she had worked so hard to achieve. The findings of the investigation led to congressional hearings on flight attendant working conditions, where Sarah's family testified about their daughter's experience and the industry's failure to protect its workers from preventable harm. Rosa Martinez's testimony was particularly powerful, as she described watching her daughter's health deteriorate over the months leading up to her death, and her frustration at being unable to help because Sarah was afraid to admit the extent of her struggles. Miguel Martinez spoke about the dreams his daughter had shared with him since childhood, and how those dreams had been twisted into a nightmare by an industry that exploited her dedication and ultimately cost her life. The hearings also featured testimony from current and former flight attendants who shared their own experiences with the working conditions that had contributed to Sarah's death. Many described similar struggles with poverty-level wages, irregular schedules, inadequate rest, and the constant stress of dealing with increasingly hostile passengers while receiving minimal support from their employers. The testimony painted a picture of an industry in crisis, where workers were pushed beyond their limits while companies focused solely on maximizing profits and minimizing costs. Labor unions representing flight attendants used Sarah's case to push for meaningful reforms in working conditions, scheduling practices, and mental health support throughout the aviation industry. The Association of Flight Attendants organized rallies and awareness campaigns, highlighting the human cost of the industry's current business model, with Sarah's story serving as a powerful symbol of the need for immediate change. Union representatives argued that Sarah's death was not an isolated tragedy, but the predictable result of systemic problems that affected thousands of aviation workers across the country. The regulatory response to Sarah's death included new requirements for airlines to provide better mental health resources for their employees, including confidential counseling services, regular wellness checks, and policies that protected workers who sought help from retaliation or discrimination. The Federal Aviation Administration also implemented new rules limiting the maximum number of consecutive duty hours for flight attendants and requiring longer rest periods between demanding trips, though critics argued that these changes were still insufficient to address the fundamental problems in the industry. Pinnacle Airlines faced significant legal and financial consequences as a result of Sarah's death, including wrongful death lawsuits filed by her family and investigations by multiple government agencies. The company was forced to pay substantial fines and implement comprehensive reforms to its scheduling practices, employee support programs, and workplace safety policies. However, many industry observers noted that the financial penalties were minimal compared to the company's annual profits, and questioned whether the reforms would be sufficient to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Sarah's story also sparked broader conversations about mental health in high-stress professions and the responsibility of employers to protect their workers from preventable harm. Mental health advocates used her case to highlight the importance of recognizing and addressing workplace stress before it reaches crisis levels, and the need for comprehensive support systems that prioritize employee well-being alongside operational efficiency. Her death became a rallying point for workers in many industries who faced similar challenges with demanding schedules, inadequate support, and cultures that stigmatized mental health struggles. The Martinez family established the Sarah Martinez Foundation in the months following her death, dedicating themselves to preventing other families from experiencing the devastating loss they had endured. The foundation provides financial assistance to flight attendants facing hardship, confidential counseling services, and advocacy for policy changes that could improve working conditions throughout the aviation industry. Maria Martinez left her accounting career to become a full-time advocate for flight attendant rights, traveling the country to speak at conferences and legislative hearings about the need for meaningful reform in the industry. The foundation also created educational programs designed to help flight attendants recognize the signs of stress and burnout in themselves and their colleagues, providing resources and support before problems reach crisis levels. These programs emphasize the importance of seeking help early and challenge the industry culture that treats asking for support as a sign of weakness rather than a demonstration of professional responsibility. The foundation works with airlines, unions, and government agencies to promote policies that support worker well-being and prevent the kind of tragedy that claimed Sarah's life. 5 years after Sarah's death, the aviation industry has made meaningful progress in addressing some of the issues that contributed to her tragedy, but significant challenges remain. Wages for regional flight attendants have increased modestly, scheduling practices have been reformed to provide better rest opportunities, and mental health resources have been expanded at many airlines. However, the fundamental business model of the regional aviation industry continues to rely on extracting maximum productivity from workers while minimizing costs, creating ongoing tensions between operational efficiency and employee well-being. The story of Sarah Martinez continues to resonate with flight attendants around the world, who recognize their own struggles in her experience and draw inspiration from the changes that her death helped to bring about. Her final text message, "This job is killing me," has become a rallying cry for workers who refuse to accept that their careers should come at the cost of their health and well-being. Training programs now include her story as a case study in the importance of recognizing and addressing workplace stress, and new flight attendants learn about the resources available to help them navigate the challenges of their demanding profession. Industry leaders acknowledge that Sarah's death marked a turning point in how the aviation industry approaches employee well-being and mental health, though many advocates argue that more needs to be done to truly honor her legacy. The changes implemented since her death represent important progress, but the fundamental challenge of balancing operational demands with human limitations remains a constant struggle in an industry where safety and efficiency are paramount concerns. Sarah's story serves as a permanent reminder that behind every uniform and professional smile is a human being deserving of dignity, respect, and working conditions that support their well-being rather than undermining it. The passengers on Flight 2574 who witnessed Sarah's collapse that day were forever changed by the experience of seeing a young woman's life end in such a tragic and preventable way. Many later contacted her family to express their condolences and share their memories of her professionalism and dedication, even in her final moments of service. Their testimonies helped to humanize Sarah's story and demonstrate the impact that individual flight attendants have on the thousands of passengers they serve throughout their careers, making her death not just a workplace safety issue, but a human tragedy that affected everyone who knew her story. As we remember Sarah Martinez today, we must commit to continuing the work she started simply by pursuing her dreams and refusing to accept that her career should cost her everything she held dear. Her legacy lives on in the policies and support systems that now exist to help flight attendants before they reach the breaking point that claimed her life. But vigilance and continued advocacy are required to ensure that her sacrifice leads to lasting change rather than temporary reforms that fade when public attention moves elsewhere. The aviation industry has made progress since Sarah's death, but her story remains relevant as long as workers in any industry face similar challenges with inadequate support and resources. Sarah's dream of flying and serving others continues through the thousands of flight attendants who now have access to better working conditions, mental health resources, and support systems because of the changes her death helped to bring about. She never got to see the world or experience the adventures she had imagined as a child watching planes cross the Texas sky, but her impact on the aviation industry and the lives of countless workers will endure long after her brief time in the skies. Her story challenges all of us to do better, to demand better, and to never stop fighting for workplaces where human dignity and well-being are valued as highly as operational efficiency and profit margins. If you or someone you know is struggling with the demands of working in aviation or any high-stress profession, please remember that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of strength and professional responsibility. Sarah's story shows us the tragic consequences of suffering in silence, but it also demonstrates the power of speaking up and seeking support before problems reach crisis levels. There are resources available now that did not exist when Sarah was struggling, and there are people who understand what you are going through because they have walked in similar shoes and survived to help others navigate the same challenges. Subscribe to our channel if these stories matter to you, if you believe that every worker deserves dignity and respect regardless of their profession, and if you want to be part of the ongoing conversation about how we can create workplaces that support human well-being rather than undermining it. Sarah Martinez was more than a statistic or a cautionary tale. She was a young woman with dreams, hopes, and unlimited potential, whose life was cut short by preventable circumstances. Her story deserves to be remembered, her sacrifice deserves to be honored, and her legacy deserves to continue through our collective commitment to ensuring that no other family has to endure the devastating loss that forever changed the Martinez family and everyone who knew Sarah's story.